The year was 1878, and the land held its breath. Out on the vast, unforgiving plains of the territory, winter was not so much a season as it was a predator, stalking the edges of the year, waiting to claim the weak. For Ezra Blackwood, the quiet of his homestead was a sound louder than any storm. It was the sound of absence, a hollow echo in the small cabin where laughter once lived. Grief was a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders as he mended a fence that bordered nothing but more emptiness, the wind his only companion, whispering of things lost. His wife, Clara, and their little boy, Henry, had been taken by the fever 2 years prior. They lay now under 2 small mounds of earth marked by simple wooden crosses, a permanent testament to the fragility of life in a place that demanded so much strength. Ezra had been a man of gentle smiles and easy words then. Now, his face was a mask carved from hardship, his mouth a grim line, his eyes holding the flat, distant look of a man who had seen too much of the world's finality. He worked from before the sun rose until long after it bled out across the horizon, the physical exhaustion a welcome distraction from the ache that resided deep in his bones. His life had become a stark, monotonous routine. Tend the few scrawny cattle that survived the dry summer, chop wood, check his traps, and sit in the crushing silence of his home. The boy's small wooden horse, still sitting on the mantelpiece, a sentinel of sorrow. One afternoon, as a sky the color of a fresh bruise promised an early frost, Ezra was riding the southern edge of his property. He was checking the weak points in a barbed wire fence, a futile effort against a land that seemed determined to reclaim everything man made. His horse, a stoic gray gelding named Boulder, stopped short, ears twitching. Ezra followed the animal's gaze and saw a shape crumpled near the dried-up creek bed. At first, he thought it was a deer, felled by a coyote. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a human form. It was a woman, and from her buckskin dress and the raven-black hair fanned out in the dust, he knew she was Cheyenne. A knot of caution tightened in his gut. The tension between settlers and the tribes was a constant, simmering threat, a fire banked but never extinguished. A lone homesteader was vulnerable, and common sense screamed at him to turn his horse and ride away, to pretend he had seen nothing. Trouble was a guest he could not afford to entertain. He was a man whittled down to the bare essentials of survival. He had nothing left to give, and certainly nothing to risk. He stayed in the saddle, watching her for a long moment. She did not move. Her stillness was profound, the kind that bordered on the edge of life itself. He could see the sharp angle of her shoulder blades through the thin material of her dress, the way the dust clung to her cracked lips. She was starving. He could see it from 20 paces away. It was a look he knew, a desperation that stripped away everything but the raw need to draw one more breath. He thought of Clara in her final days, the way her strength had just evaporated. With a curse that was more a prayer of resignation, he dismounted. The leather of his saddle groaned in protest. He approached slowly, his hands held out and open, a gesture he hoped would be understood if she were conscious. She did not stir. Kneeling beside her, he saw the faint, fluttery pulse in the hollow of her throat. Her skin was hot and dry to the touch. Dehydration, starvation, exhaustion, a lethal trinity on the plains. Her face, though smudged with dirt and etched with suffering, held a fierce pride in its bone structure. She was young, perhaps no older than 20. He looked back toward his cabin, a small speck of smoke rising from its chimney. Then he looked at her. The world told him she was an enemy, a danger, a problem to be avoided. But what he saw was simply a human being at the very end of her tether, the part of him that he thought had died with his family, the part that knew compassion, stirred painfully in his chest. He couldn't leave her. Leaving her would be an act of cruelty that would haunt his already crowded ghosts. With a grunt of effort, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of flour, a fragile collection of bones. He carried her to his horse, managed to settle her in front of him in the saddle, and began the slow walk back to the cabin, her head lolling against his chest. The silence he had known for 2 years had been broken, and he had no idea if he had just invited salvation or ruin into his home. He laid her gently on the cot in the corner of the single room, the one he normally used for storing gear. He brought a dipper of water first, lifting her head and letting the cool liquid trickle past her lips. She coughed, and her eyes fluttered open. They were dark and deep, and for a moment they were filled with a wild, cornered animal fear. She tried to push herself up, a flash of defiance in her weakness. "Easy," Ezra said, his voice rough from disuse. He held up his hands again. "Water, just water." She stared at him, her gaze traveling from his worn face to the stark, clean interior of the cabin, finally resting on the small wooden horse on the mantel. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes before they closed again, her brief surge of strength depleted. She drank the next dipper of water more readily, a silent acknowledgement of her own desperate need. Ezra knew she needed more than water. She needed food. He looked at his own meager supplies. He had a small sack of cornmeal, half a slab of salted bacon, and one single solitary loaf of bread he had baked 2 days ago. It was meant to last him until his trip into the settlement of Prairie Dog Creek, a journey he wouldn't make for another week at least. That loaf of bread was precious. It was sustenance. It was survival. He looked at the woman on his cot, at the hollows in her cheeks. He remembered Clara wasting away and the terrible feeling of helplessness as he had watched her fade. He could not cure the fever, but this he could do something about. He walked to the shelf, took down the loaf of bread and sliced a thick piece from it. He put it on a tin plate and brought it to her. Her eyes opened again as he approached. They were wary, suspicious. He set the plate down beside her on the floor, then retreated to the other side of the room, giving her space. He sat at his small table and watched. For a long time she just looked at the bread, as if it might be a trick. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, she reached for it. She broke off a tiny piece and ate it, chewing with a profound slowness, as if reacquainting her body with the very idea of food. She ate half the slice, then carefully wrapped the rest in a corner of her tunic and lay back, her breathing already seeming a little less shallow. She had saved the rest. The act spoke of a life lived in uncertainty, of a discipline born from hardship. It was a mirror of his own careful rationing, and in that small, silent gesture, a thread of understanding was spun between them in the quiet cabin. For the next 2 days, they existed in a state of watchful truce. He offered her food. She accepted it with a quiet dignity that never wavered. He never pressed her for information, and she offered none. They communicated through gestures. He would point to the water bucket. She would nod. She would point to the healing cut on her leg. He would bring her a clean rag and some salve. He gave her space, letting her sleep in the cabin while he took his bedroll to the barn, the scent of hay and horse a familiar comfort. He found himself listening for her movements, for the sound of her breathing. The silence of the cabin was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with a quiet presence, a life he had chosen to protect. On the 3rd morning, he woke in the barn to find her standing in the doorway. She had washed her face and hair, and though still thin, a measure of strength had returned to her. She wore one of Clara's old shawls he had left out for her, and it hung loosely on her frame. She looked at him, her dark eyes clear and direct. Then she pointed to herself and spoke one word. "Vavina." Ezra nodded, understanding. "Ezra," he replied, pointing to his own chest. Vavina gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then she pointed east, toward the rising sun. Her meaning was clear. She was leaving. He felt a strange pang of something. Not disappointment exactly. More like a return to the inevitable quiet he had known before. He walked with her to the edge of his property, the same spot where he had found her. The sun was casting long shadows across the plains. She stopped and turned to him. She reached into a small pouch at her waist that he hadn't noticed before and pulled out a single eagle feather, its tip dyed a vibrant red. She held it out to him. It was a powerful gift, he knew that much. A symbol of courage, of honor. He hesitated, feeling unworthy. He had only given her a piece of bread. She pressed it into his hand, her fingers briefly brushing his. Her touch was warm, her eyes held his for a long moment, and in their depths he saw a promise and a gratitude so profound it needed no words. Then, without a backward glance, she turned and began walking east, a small, resilient figure swallowed by the immense landscape. Ezra stood there for a long time, the feather clutched in his hand, watching until she was gone. Then he turned and walked back to his silent cabin, the quiet somehow heavier than before. The seasons turned with the unforgiving rhythm of the prairie. Autumn's brief, golden reprieve gave way to the iron-gray fist of winter. The wind grew teeth, howling around the corners of the cabin like a grieving soul. Ezra's already difficult existence became a desperate struggle. A blight had taken most of his meager corn crop, and an early, vicious cold snap had claimed 2 of his remaining cattle. He was more isolated than ever, the snows cutting him off from the distant settlement. His supplies dwindled at an alarming rate. He rationed his food with a miser's care, the pangs of hunger, a constant, gnawing companion. The cold was relentless, seeping through the chinks in the cabin walls that he constantly plugged with mud and grass. Some days he felt his resolve cracking, the profound loneliness threatening to consume him entirely. He spent his evenings staring into the fire, the eagle feather Vivina had given him tucked into the leather binding of an old book. It was a tangible reminder of a moment of connection in a life that had become devoid of it. Just before the deepest part of winter set in, he had been forced to make a trip to Prairie Dog Creek. The town was little more than a muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings, but it was the only source of supplies for 100 miles. It was there he had the misfortune of running into Arthur Callahan. Callahan was a man who had gotten rich on cattle and arrogance, buying up smaller homesteads from desperate men. He saw Ezra's gaunt face and worn-out clothes and smelled opportunity. Blackwood, Callahan had boomed, his voice slick with false sympathy as he blocked Ezra's path outside the general store. Heard you had a rough season. That land of yours is too much for one man, especially a man with your luck. Ezra just stared at him, his face impassive. It's my land, Callahan. For now, Callahan sneered, dropping the pretense. Winter's coming. A bad one, they say. It'll finish you. Sell to me now, and you can walk away with something in your pocket. Wait, and all I'll have to do is file a claim on your abandoned plot come spring. I'm not abandoning it, Ezra said, his voice low and cold. Callahan laughed, a harsh, grating sound. We'll see. Pride don't fill a man's belly or keep him warm. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Ezra's boots. When you're freezing to death, remember my offer. Now, with a blizzard raging outside, burying his world in a sea of white, Callahan's words echoed in his mind. The storm had lasted for 3 days without a break. The wind shrieked, and the snow piled in drifts that reached the cabin's windowsills. His woodpile was nearly gone, his food reduced to a handful of dried beans and a sliver of bacon. His last cow, a bony creature he called Hope, lay dying in the barn, her breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Ezra sat by the dying fire, the cold a living thing that crawled under his skin and settled in his marrow. He was too weak from hunger to bring in the cow's carcass for meat, even if he had the strength to butcher it. It was over. Callahan had been right. He had fought the land, fought the grief, fought the loneliness, and he had lost. He felt a strange sense of calm settle over him, the kind that comes when all struggle ceases. He thought of Clara and Henry, and for the first time in a long while, the memory brought not a sharp pain, but a dull, weary peace. Perhaps he would see them soon. He closed his eyes, the eagle feather clutched in his hand, and resigned himself to the encroaching cold. It was a sound that pulled him back from the precipice, a sound that did not belong in the blizzard's symphony of chaos. It was the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves, muffled by the deep snow. Ezra's eyes snapped open. He thought his mind was playing tricks on him, conjuring phantoms in his final moments. But the sound grew louder, closer. He struggled to his feet, his joints screaming in protest, and peered through a small, ice-caked pane of the window. Through the swirling vortex of white, he saw them, figures on horseback, moving like ghosts through the storm. There were at least a dozen of them, their forms dark against the snow. Cheyenne warriors. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it then, not a slow death by cold, but a swift end. He reached for the old rifle propped against the wall, his hand trembling not from fear, but from profound weakness. He would not die on his knees. The riders stopped a short distance from the cabin, forming a silent, intimidating crescent. One figure dismounted and began to walk toward the door. The figure was smaller than the others, moving with a grace and authority that defied the brutal weather. As the person drew closer, the wind whipped back the hood of their heavy, fur-lined cloak. Ezra's breath caught in his throat. The rifle slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor. It was Vivina. She was not the starving, desperate woman he had found by the creek. Her face was fuller, glowing with health and vitality. She was dressed in magnificent, decorated buckskins, adorned with intricate quillwork and beads that caught the faint light. Her hair was bound in two neat braids, and her expression was one of immense calm and power. She radiated an authority that was absolute. She was a queen. She stopped before his door and simply waited. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, Ezra forced his numb limbs to move. He unlatched the door and pulled it open, the wind tearing into the cabin's meager warmth. They stood facing each other, the blizzard raging around them. One of the warriors, an older man with a face like a weathered map, moved to her side. He looked at Ezra, then spoke to Vivina in their native tongue. Vivina responded, her voice clear and melodic, never taking her eyes off Ezra's face. Then she spoke to Ezra, her English hesitant but clear, learned in the intervening seasons. "You are Ezra," she said, less a question than a statement. He could only nod, his throat too tight for words. "I told my people of the man with quiet eyes who shared his only bread when the Great Spirit had turned his face from me," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "My father was a great chief. He died in the moon of the falling leaves. The council, they listened to my words. They chose my husband Kuruk to lead, but they listened to me. They honor the debt I carry." She gestured behind her, to the pack horses laden with supplies. "We have brought food, furs, firewood. You will not die in this place." Ezra was speechless, his mind struggling to comprehend the scene before him. The world had turned upside down. The woman he had saved from starvation had returned through an impossible storm, leading a band of warriors to save him in turn. But she was not finished. She took a step closer, her dark eyes filled with a fierce intensity. "My people have prospered. We have many horses. We have winter grounds in the sheltered valley, where the wind cannot kill. We have more than we need." She paused, letting her words sink in. "You shared all you had. Now, I offer you the same. Come with us. Half of our herds will be yours. You will have a lodge next to the chiefs. You will have a place of honor. You will never know hunger or cold again. I offer you half of all we have." The offer hung in the frigid air, impossibly vast. Half a kingdom laid at the feet of a broken man in a ruined cabin. He looked at her, at the powerful, respected leader she had become, and then he looked at his own chapped, empty hands. He thought of Callahan's cruel laughter and the world's casual brutality. And he thought of a simple act of kindness, a shared loaf of bread. A faint, unfamiliar sensation stirred within him. It was the ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time in years. He slowly shook his head, not in refusal but in wonder. "Vivina," he said, his voice raspy but steady. "I didn't do it for a reward." He fumbled inside his coat and pulled out the eagle feather. It was worn from his touch. He held it out to her. "I did it because you were a person in need. That's all." Vivina looked at the feather in his hand, then back at his face. A deep, profound understanding passed between them. Her regal facade softened, and he saw in her eyes the same woman he had met by the creek, the one who possessed a spirit that starvation could not quench. She nodded slowly. "I know," she said softly. "That is why you are worthy of the offer." He did not take half her kingdom, no man could, but he accepted their help. The Cheyenne warriors at her command filled his small cabin with firewood, unloaded sacks of grain and smoked meat, and covered his bed with thick, warm buffalo robes. They tended to his dying cow with a skill that shamed his own, bringing the animal back from the brink. They worked with quiet efficiency, turning his tomb of a cabin back into a place of life. Ezra did not become a chief or a wealthy man in the way Arthur Callahan would understand it. But as the winter thawed, he found he had received something far greater than land or horses. He had received a community. He was no longer an island of grief in a sea of grass. He learned to share meals at their winter camp in the sheltered valley, the sound of their language becoming familiar, the laughter of their children, a balm on his wounded soul. Vivina and her husband, Kuruk, became his friends, their bond forged not in a transaction, but in mutual respect and a shared understanding of hardship. He kept his homestead, but it was no longer a place of isolation. It became a bridge between two worlds. He learned from them, and they, in turn, respected the quiet man with the sad eyes who had shown kindness without asking for anything in return. The emptiness in his heart began to fill, not with a replacement for what he had lost, but with something new, a sense of belonging, a purpose. One day in late spring, as he rode with Kuruk, checking on the tribe's horse herds, he saw Arthur Callahan in the distance, his face a mask of disbelief as he watched Ezra ride alongside the Cheyenne chief. Ezra simply nodded in his direction, a silent acknowledgement of a battle won not with fences or force, but with a single loaf of bread. He had been offered a kingdom, and in a way, he had accepted. It was not a kingdom of land or power, but one of the human heart, built on the foundations of unexpected kindness, a place where a man could finally, after a long and brutal winter, feel at home. The year was 1884, and the land held its breath under the weight of a vast, indifferent sky. For Arthur Blackwood, this silence was both a punishment and a sanctuary. His ranch was a lonely island in a sea of Wyoming sagebrush and unforgiving wind, pressed against the stoic foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. The place was a monument to a life that had ended before his own had. Every fence post he'd driven, every stone in the hearth he had set with his wife, Eleanor, every patch of earth in the small garden held the ghost of her laughter. And the silence, the god-awful, unending silence, was the space their daughter, little Clara, was supposed to have filled. Grief was not a feeling for Arthur. It was a physical state. It was the permanent chill in his bones that the summer sun could not touch, the stoop in his shoulders that had nothing to do with the labor of the ranch. He had buried them both 7 years ago, taken by a fever that swept through their small world with the speed and mercy of a wildfire. Since then, his life had contracted to the size of his property lines. He tended his small herd of cattle, mended what was broken, and spoke only to his horse and occasionally to the traders in the distant town of Redemption, a place whose name he found to be a bitter irony. His routine was a bulwark against memory, a series of mindless tasks to occupy the hands, while the heart remained a hollow, aching void. He was a man living in the past tense, a walking ghost on his own land. The dawn that changed everything broke like any other, spilling pale, watery light over the eastern plains. Arthur rose from his cot, the familiar ache in his back, a dull companion. He pulled on his worn boots, his movements slow and deliberate, a liturgy of survival. He stepped out of the cabin, intending to draw water from the well, and stopped. The world tilted on its axis. The familiar, empty expanse of his porch was no longer empty. Tied to the 4 support posts were 4 young women, native women. Their wrists were bound with soft leather thongs, secured to the wood with a deliberate, almost ceremonial neatness. They were not gagged, but a profound, collective silence held them captive more effectively than any cloth. Their dark eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and fierce, defiant pride, followed his every move. They were young, ranging from what looked to be late adolescence to early 20s. They wore simple hide dresses, unadorned, and their black hair was braided, clean, and cared for. This was not the work of brutish captors. This was something else entirely. Something colder, more calculated. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. His first instinct was pure, primal fear, a trap, a provocation. He scanned the horizon, the rolling hills, the shadowed coulees. Nothing. The land was as empty and quiet as it had been a moment before. His gaze returned to the porch, to them. The youngest, who couldn't have been more than 16, trembled visibly, her eyes fixed on the ground. The one beside her, her face a mask of stoic resolve, met his gaze without flinching. Another watched him with an unnerving, analytical stillness, as if cataloguing his every breath. And the eldest, positioned nearest the door, carried herself with the authority of a leader, her chin held high, her fear buried deep beneath layers of responsibility. For a long moment he was paralyzed. The silence of his life had been shattered, replaced by a new, terrifying silence filled with unspoken questions and imminent threat. His isolation, once a source of comfort, now felt like a vulnerability. There was no one to call for, no one to consult. There was only him and the 4 women bound to his home and the vast, watching wilderness. He took a slow breath, the cold morning air stinging his lungs. The routines that had sustained him, the walls of grief he had built around himself, were useless now. He had been presented with a choice he never asked for, a test he did not understand. He reached for the hunting knife on his belt, its worn handle a familiar weight in his palm. The women tensed, a collective intake of breath, and the eldest straightened her spine even further, ready to meet whatever violence was coming. Arthur ignored their fear, his focus narrowed. He walked not towards them, but to the first post, and with a single, decisive motion, he sliced through the leather binding. The leather fell away, and the first woman, the one with the analytical gaze, slowly, cautiously, pulled her hand back. She rubbed her wrist, her eyes never leaving his face. Arthur moved to the next post, then the next, and the next, repeating the action with the same grim economy of motion. He did not speak. The sound of the blade slicing through the thongs was unnervingly loud in the morning stillness. When the last bond was cut, he stepped back, holding the knife loosely at his side, showing them his empty hands before sheathing it. He retreated to the far side of the porch, putting the well between them, a deliberate act of creating space. He watched them. They did not flee. They remained by the posts, now unbound but still captive, by fear, by uncertainty, by orders he could not fathom. The eldest, Winona, slowly pushed herself to her feet. She moved to her sisters, her presence a shield. Istus, the quiet observer, stood beside her. Then Wachiwi, the one who had trembled, was helped to her feet by Zitkala, the youngest and most defiant. They stood together, a small, united front, their dark eyes, a silent chorus of questions. Furs. Arthur's mind raced. Who had done this, and why his porch? He was a nobody, a recluse. He had no quarrel with the local tribes. He kept to his own, respected their boundaries. This felt personal, targeted. He thought of the town, redemption, a place teeming with men who saw the tribes as little more than vermin or obstacles. But this act had none of the chaotic brutality of a raid. It was precise, deliberate, a message. He turned and worked the pump handle of the well, the rhythmic squeak a familiar sound in the tense air. He filled a tin dipper with cold, clear water and placed it on the edge of the well housing, a good 10 feet from them. Then he backed away again, retreating to the cabin doorway. He gestured toward the water, a simple, universal offering. The women watched him, unmoving. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sun climbed higher, chasing the last of the morning chill from the air. Arthur's legs began to ache from standing so still. Finally, Winona, the leader, gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Zitkala, the defiant one, moved first. She approached the well with the cautious grace of a deer, snatched the dipper, and drank deeply, her throat working. She drank not like someone merely thirsty, but like someone asserting a right. Then she returned to the group. One by one they came forward to drink, each movement guarded, each glance at him filled with suspicion. But they drank. Hunger would be next. His own stomach rumbled. He turned and went inside the cabin, leaving the door ajar. The interior was sparse and functional. A table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth, a bed. And on a small shelf, a single small whittled wooden bird, its paint faded. Clara's. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the task at hand. He took a half loaf of yesterday's bread from the bin and a round of cheese. It was plain fare, but it was all he had to offer. He carried it out and set it on the same spot where he'd left the water. He didn't wait for a reaction this time. He turned his back on them, a profound gesture of trust he wasn't sure he felt, and walked toward the corral to see to his horse. The morning chores would not wait, and perhaps the familiar rhythm would anchor him, would make sense of this madness. He could feel their 4 pairs of eyes on his back every step of the way. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent pattern. The women did not leave. They stayed near the cabin, a small, watchful constellation. They spoke to one another in their own tongue, their voices low and musical, a language that was part of the land itself. To Arthur, they remained silent. He went about his work, acutely aware of their presence. The heavy cloak of his solitude had been replaced by a tense, shared space. He left food and water for them each morning, and each evening it was gone. They slept huddled together on the porch, refusing his silent offer of the barn's warmer shelter. He learned their faces, their mannerisms. Winona was the clear matriarch, her gaze missing nothing, her posture one of constant vigilance. She was the one who rationed the food he left, who decided when and where they would sit. Istas was the thinker, her eyes always distant, as if she were seeing patterns in the wind or reading a story in the clouds. Wachiwi, the gentle one, seemed to possess a deep well of sadness that mirrored his own, and she often flinched at sudden noises. And Zitkala, the youngest, was a firecracker. Her defiance was a shield for her fear, and she would sometimes glare at him with an intensity that was almost comical on her young face. He did not try to speak to them again. He knew no Lakota, and he assumed they knew no English. Words, he figured, would only complicate the fragile, unspoken truce they had established. His actions would have to speak for him. He was a man who provided, who kept his distance, who meant no harm. He hoped that was enough. But the silence of the cabin was different now. Before, it had been an empty, echoing thing, a constant reminder of all he had lost. Now, it was filled with a quiet, breathing presence. He would sit at his table in the evening, eating his solitary meal, and he could hear the soft murmur of their voices from the porch, the rustle of their movements. It was unsettling, but it was also not entirely unwelcome. It was the sound of life. It was a sound he had forgotten. The breakthrough, when it came, was small and unexpected. It was nearly a week after their arrival. Arthur was in the small vegetable garden Eleanor had started, his hands deep in the soil, weeding around the struggling squash plants. It was a task he both loved and hated, a direct communion with her memory. He was lost in thought when a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Wachiwi standing there. She held out a handful of wild berries, dark and plump, on a large leaf. He stared at her, then at the berries. It was an offering, a reciprocation. He slowly wiped his earthy hands on his trousers and reached out, taking a single berry. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. She gave a small, hesitant smile, the first he had seen from any of the mand, popped a berry into her own mouth to show they were safe. He ate his. It was sweet, with a tart finish that burst on his tongue. "Thank you," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. She did not seem to understand the words, but she understood the tone. She nodded, placed the leaf of berries on a nearby crate, and then, to his utter astonishment, she knelt in the dirt beside him and began to weed. Her movements were deft and sure. She worked in silence, her focus absolute. Soon, Zitkala came to watch, her curiosity overriding her suspicion. Then Istus joined, her quiet presence a calm anchor. Winona stood back, observing, her expression unreadable but no longer hostile. That afternoon, they worked together in the garden. For the first time, they were not just observers in his space, but participants. The shared simple labor of tending the earth became a bridge across the chasm of language and culture. That evening, he cooked a stew with the day's harvest, a rabbit he had snared, and the vegetables from the garden. He left the pot on the porch hearth with 4 bowls and spoons. Later, from his window, he saw them sitting together, eating from the bowls, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of his lantern. Something inside Arthur began to shift. The hard, frozen ground of his grief began to thaw just a little around the edges. He started seeing them not as a collective problem, but as 4 individuals. He saw the way Istus would tilt her head to listen to the birds, the way Zitkala would race Wachiwi to the creek, their laughter a startling, beautiful sound against the wind. He saw the immense weight of responsibility on Winona's young shoulders and admired the strength with which she carried it. One evening, a storm rolled in from the mountains, a violent, terrifying display of nature's power. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled like a grieving animal. Rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. Arthur stood at his open cabin door, watching the women huddled together on the porch, trying to find shelter against the far wall. They were soaked, shivering. He couldn't leave them out there. His own memory of fever and cold was too sharp, too painful. He stepped out onto the porch, the wind tearing at his shirt. "Inside," he said, his voice loud to be heard over the storm. He gestured emphatically toward the open door. Winona hesitated, her eyes filled with distrust. The cabin was his space, his den. To enter it was to put themselves entirely at his mercy. But then a flash of lightning illuminated Wachiwi's pale, trembling form, and her resolve wavered. Arthur didn't wait for her permission. He went to Wachiwi, gently took her arm, and guided her toward the door. She went without resistance, too cold to argue. The others followed, one by one, led by Winona, who entered last, her gaze sweeping the small space, assessing every shadow for threats. He closed the door, shutting out the storm's fury. The cabin was suddenly small, crowded, filled with the scent of wet earth and rain. He stoked the fire in the hearth until it blazed, casting a warm, dancing light over their faces. He handed them dry blankets from his chest, his movements slow and non-threatening. They wrapped themselves in the rough wool and huddled near the fire, their shivering slowly subsiding. Arthur retreated to his corner, giving them the space around the hearth. He sat at his table and picked up the small wooden bird from the shelf. He ran his thumb over its smooth, worn surface, the action automatic, unconscious. He didn't realize he was being watched until he looked up and saw Istus's intelligent eyes on him, then on the bird. He saw not pity in her gaze, but a quiet, profound understanding. In that moment, he felt a flicker of connection so deep it startled him. She saw his pain. She saw the ghost in the room. He cleared his throat and carefully placed the bird back on its shelf. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of quiet had settled. It was not the empty silence of loneliness, nor the tense silence of suspicion. It was a shared, peaceful quiet. A fragile truce had become a fragile trust. For the first time in 7 years, Arthur Blackwood did not feel entirely alone. He was sharing his home, and in doing so, he was beginning to feel like he had one again. The tentative peace of their new existence was a delicate thing, a spider's web in a world of stomping boots. Arthur knew it couldn't last. The world outside his property lines was still there, and it was a world that did not look kindly on a white man sheltering 4 Lakota women. The first tremor came in the form of Garrett Vance. Vance was a man who thrived on the festering prejudices of redemption. He was a rancher with more land than sense, and a cruelty that he mistook for strength. He and 2 of his hired hands rode up to Arthur's fence one afternoon, their horses kicking up dust that settled on the new, fragile green in the garden. Arthur saw them coming from a mile off. He told the women to go inside the barn and stay hidden, his tone low and urgent. For the first time, Winona obeyed without question, herding her sisters into the shadows of the hayloft. Arthur met Vance at the fence, his posture relaxed, his hands empty and visible. He leaned against a post as if he had all the time in the world. "Blackwood," Vance said, his voice a gravelly sneer. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Arthur's boot. "Heard you got some company." "Just me and the wind, Vance," Arthur replied, his voice flat, "same as always." Vance's eyes, small and porcine, scanned the property. They lingered on the cabin, the barn, the garden where 4 sets of footprints were still visible in the soft earth. "That ain't the story making the rounds in town. Story is you're keeping a private collection of squaws out here, 4 of 'em." Arthur's blood ran cold, but his face remained a mask of indifference. People in redemption have too much time on their hands. They should worry more about their own souls. "Oh, I'm worried about souls, all right," Vance chuckled, a greasy, unpleasant sound. "A man like you, all alone out here, it ain't healthy. A man gets ideas. We just came to see if you needed any help. Maybe take them off your hands. The government pays a decent bounty for strays." The word strays landed like a punch to the gut. Arthur pushed himself off the fence post, his quiet demeanor hardening into something colder, sharper. "There's nothing here for you, Vance. This is my land. You do well to remember that." "Is that so?" Vance's smile vanished. He shared a look with his men. "We'll see about that. A man can't just hoard property, especially not that kind of property." He wheeled his horse around. "We'll be back, Blackwood. Count on it." They rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a thick, choking sense of dread in their wake. Arthur watched them until they were small specks on the horizon. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The protective instinct that rose in him was fierce, primal. It was the same feeling he'd had when Clara had a fever, the desperate need to stand between his child and the darkness. He had failed then. He would not fail now. He went to the barn. The women emerged from the hayloft, their faces pale. They had heard everything. Winona's eyes met his, and in them he saw not fear, but a shared understanding of the coming fight. The unspoken truce was over. They were allies now, bound by a common enemy. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was thick with anticipation. Arthur cleaned his rifle, his movements precise and methodical. The women sat by the fire, sharpening kitchen knives on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a grim counterpoint to the chirping of crickets outside. There was no need for words. They were preparing for a siege. Arthur felt a strange sense of clarity. For 7 years, he had been drifting, a man without purpose. Now, purpose had been thrust upon him. It was simple, elemental, to protect the life that had taken root in his desolate world. These women, who had arrived as a mystery, a burden, had become the heart of his home. Their quiet dignity, their resilience, their unexpected laughter had tilled the fallow soil of his soul. To let Vance and his ilk harm them would be to let the last light in his life be extinguished. He looked at them, a small fortress of women by his hearth. Winona, the unbreachable wall. Istus, the strategist, her eyes darting toward the windows. Wachiwi, no longer trembling, but holding her knife with a steady hand, and Zitkala, her youthful face set in a grim, determined line. They were not victims waiting for rescue, they were warriors. "They will come tonight," Arthur said, breaking the silence. He didn't know how he knew, but he felt it in his bones. The moon was a slender sliver, offering little light. It was a night for predators. Winona looked at him and gave a single sharp nod. She then spoke to her sisters in Lakota, her voice calm and commanding. They took their positions, 2 by the single window, 2 flanking the door. Arthur took his place by the other window, his rifle resting on the sill. And then they waited. The cabin grew silent once more, but this was the silence of a held breath, the taut, humming silence before a lightning strike. The hours crawled by. The only sounds were the crackle of the low fire and the frantic beating of his own heart. He thought of Eleanor, of her strength and her kindness. He thought of Clara, of the fierce, boundless love he had for her. The grief was still there, a permanent fixture in the architecture of his being, but it was no longer a hollow void. It was a source of strength. It was the memory of what was worth fighting for. They came just after midnight, the soft thud of horses' hooves on damp earth. Arthur saw their shapes moving in the darkness, dismounting near the fence line, 3 of them, Vance and his 2 men. They moved toward the cabin like wolves, confident in their numbers and their malice. Blackwood, Vance's voice cut through the night, a harsh, ugly sound. "We know you're in there, and we know who you're with. Send out the squaws, and we'll let you live. This ain't your fight." Arthur's knuckles were white on the stock of his rifle. He looked at Winona. Her eyes were chips of obsidian in the firelight. She gave him another curt nod. This was their decision as much as his. He raised his voice, pitching it to Carrie. "You're on my land, Vance. I'm giving you one chance to turn around and ride away." A harsh laugh answered him. Brave words for a dead man. A shot rang out, splintering the wood of the window frame next to Arthur's head. The siege had begun. He didn't return fire. Ammunition was precious, and he wouldn't waste it on shadows. The women remained perfectly still, their discipline absolute. Another shot, this one shattering a pane of glass. Cold night air rushed in. Then, the heavy thud of a body hitting the cabin door. They were trying to break it down. Arthur moved away from the window, pressing his back against the wall beside the door, his rifle ready. Winona and Zitkala flanked the other side, their knives held low. The door shuddered again, the wood groaning in protest. The bar he had set across it was thick oak, but it wouldn't hold forever. Another slam, harder this time. A crack appeared in the door. They were using a log as a ram. Arthur's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He prepared himself. The moment the door gave way, there would be chaos, violence, and death. He was ready to meet it. The door splintered, then burst inward with a deafening crash, the bar flying across the room. The shape of a man filled the doorway, silhouetted against the faint starlight. Before Arthur could even raise his rifle, something moved in the darkness with impossible speed. It was Winona. She launched herself forward, not with a scream, but with a low, guttural cry. Her knife flashed in the firelight. The man grunted, a sound of pained surprise, and stumbled back. Another man, Vance, pushed past him, a pistol in his hand. Arthur swung his rifle, not to shoot, but using it as a club, catching Vance hard in the shoulder. The pistol discharged into the ceiling as Vance staggered sideways, roaring in pain and fury. The third man charged in, but was met by Istas and Wachiwi, who moved with a terrifying, coordinated grace, their own knives weaving a deadly pattern in the confined space. It was a desperate, chaotic melee in the small cabin. Grunts of pain, the clash of steel, the crash of overturned furniture. Arthur wrestled with Vance, a brutal, close-quarters struggle. Vance was bigger, heavier, but Arthur was fueled by a cold, righteous fury. He drove his fist into Vance's face, then again, feeling cartilage crunch under his knuckles. Just as Vance fell back, his eyes rolling in his head, a new sound cut through the din. It was a cry from outside, high and sharp, a sound that was both a command and a warning. It was followed by the thunder of a dozen horses, appearing as if from the very earth itself. The fighting inside the cabin stopped instantly. Everyone froze. From the darkness outside the broken doorway, figures emerged. Tall, imposing men, their faces painted for war, their hands holding rifles and war clubs. They moved with a silent, lethal purpose, surrounding the cabin. And then a man stepped into the doorway, his presence commanding the space. He was older, his face a testament to a life of hardship and leadership, his long hair streaked with grey. His eyes, dark and piercing, surveyed the scene. The broken door, the disheveled figures of Vance and his men, Arthur standing with his rifle, and the four women, unharmed, standing ready. He was the father. He had to be. Vance's remaining henchman, seeing the ring of warriors, dropped his knife with a clatter and raised his hands, his face a mask of pure terror. Vance, dazed on the floor, simply stared, his arrogance shattered. The chief, for he could be nothing else, let his gaze rest on his daughters. He spoke a single word in Lakota. Winona answered, her voice steady, recounting the night's events. The chief listened, his expression unreadable, then his eyes found Arthur. He looked at the white man, at his bruised knuckles and his steady rifle, at the protective stance he still held in front of the women. He looked at him for a long, silent moment, and in that gaze, Arthur felt he was being weighed, measured, and judged not by the color of his skin, but by the content of his heart. The chief gave a sharp command. 2 of his warriors entered the cabin, seizing Vance and his men, hauling them to their feet. They dragged the terrified men outside, their pleas for mercy swallowed by the vast, indifferent night. Their fate was sealed. The chief stepped fully into the cabin. He looked at Arthur, and then he spoke, his voice deep and resonant. And to Arthur's profound shock, he spoke in clear, deliberate English. "You did not run," the chief said. "It was not a question, it was a statement of fact." Arthur slowly lowered his rifle. "This is my home," he said simply. They were my guests." The chief's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. He was Tashunka. He was the leader of a band of Lakota whose traditional lands bordered this territory. He explained, his words chosen with care, that his people were in a precarious position, caught between a sickness in their winter camp and the growing encroachment of men like Vance. He needed to move his people, but he could not risk his daughters on the journey. He had heard of the solitary white man, the one who lived in sorrow, who bothered no one and kept the old ways of respect. "I brought my daughters here," Tashunka said, his eyes meeting Arthur's. "I left them on your porch. It was a test, a desperate one. I needed to know if your heart was true before I could ask for your help. I have been watching, from the hills, every day. I saw you cut them free. I saw you share your food. I saw you stand against those men." He gestured to the broken door. "I saw you build a home where there was only a house." Arthur was speechless. The mystery was solved, but the truth of it was more staggering than anything he could have imagined. His every action for the past 2 weeks had been observed, evaluated. He had been part of a trial without even knowing it. Winona stepped forward, standing beside her father. She looked at Arthur, and for the first time her expression was completely open, stripped of its defensive layers. "My father Tashunka thanks you," she said, her own English as clear as her father's. "You have proven to be a man of honor, Arthur Blackwood." The name on her lips, spoken with respect, felt like a christening. He was no longer just the grieving widower. He was Arthur Blackwood, a man of honor. The aftermath was quiet. Tashunka's warriors disappeared as silently as they had arrived, taking Vance and his men with them. Justice would be meted out on their own terms. Tashunka stayed, sharing a pipe with Arthur by the fire in the now quiet cabin. They spoke for hours. 2 fathers from different worlds, finding common ground in their shared desire to protect what they loved. They spoke of loss, of hardship, of the changing land. A bridge of understanding was built over the ashes of the night's conflict. In the morning, the women prepared to leave. Their ordeal was over. They could rejoin their people, who were now making a safe passage to a new valley. The goodbyes were not spoken with words, but with looks and gestures. Wachiwi placed a small, intricately beaded pouch in his hand. Ista simply met his gaze with a look of deep, grateful understanding. Zitkala, her youthful defiance replaced by a newfound respect, gave him a quick, shy smile. Winona was the last. She stood before him on the porch, the morning sun casting a warm glow around her. "You have a strong heart, Arthur Blackwood," she said. "My father says it is a heart big enough to heal. You," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you brought life back to this place. I won't forget that." She reached out and briefly touched his arm, a gesture of profound connection. Then she turned and joined her father and sisters, mounting the horses they had brought. Arthur stood on his porch and watched them ride away, their forms growing smaller and smaller until they were swallowed by the vastness of the plains. He turned and looked at his cabin. The door was broken, the inside a mess, but it felt more like a home than it had in 7 years. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the hollow ache of absence, but the quiet peace of earned solitude. It was filled with the echoes of laughter, the memory of shared work, the warmth of a fire shared with new friends. He walked inside and began to clean up, to repair what was broken. As he worked, he found the small, whittled bird on the floor where it had fallen. He picked it up and placed it back on its shelf. But this time, he set the beaded pouch Wachiwi had given him right beside it, the past and the present, together. He was no longer a man trapped in a memory. He had been tested, and in protecting others, he had inadvertently saved himself. The wind still blew across the empty plains, but to Arthur Blackwood, it no longer sounded like a thing grieving. It sounded like a promise. The world was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but he had learned that even in the most desolate of landscapes, unexpected kindness could take root, and the truest home was the one you built in the hearts of others.